It's on.
Okay.
You have to send.
Okay, everyone. Welcome to the First Presbyterian Church in Cedar Rapids, the Insight class for Sunday. We're recording this on Saturday afternoon and hope to have a good discussion. This is a first for me, and I think it's probably a first for other people, so we'll look forward to this. So now that we see here, there's a link down here at the bottom that goes to a set of notes that I made. So nobody has to frantically try to take names or links down. And with that, we'll start the conversation. And what I'm going to do, just to make a good recording, is I'm going to mute everybody for now, and then I'll open it up once I say a few things and have a conversation, and then go like that. Okay, so everyone should be muted. And I was asked to speak today on social networks. And, you know, are they terrible? Are they destroying society? Can they be used for good? You know, what's the deal with social networks? And for those of you who are following the Insights class at First Presbyterian, we had a co-professor, Renee Penalver, last week talk about various social networks and their rise. And I was able to see that presentation, and it seemed to me that she pretty much laid out the rise of social networks ever since MySpace and going into Facebook, and what's been happening lately with Twitter and TikTok and all these things. And if you watch or tag into unfiltered social media, I would say that you would have an idea that maybe everybody's gone crazy. It's just this wild west of ideas and opinions and a lot of fear and anger and calling people out. And so it's not a really pleasant place to just hang out. But if you curate and pick your friends and decide who you want to listen to, it is kind of entertaining. And I got started in it in 2008, just before the flood, because the new editor that we'd hired at the Gazette said I needed to follow 10 people on Twitter to understand what was happening on media. So that got me active on Twitter and Facebook. And then as things progressed, just with work and things, you know, all the different Skype and Zoom and LinkedIn and all those networks. So I think of myself as relatively plugged in. But what has happened in the last 6 weeks is really amazing to me. What I've observed is people, because of the quarantine and because of having all kinds of time, have not only increased their use of social media and the social sharing services like this, like Zoom, have just skyrocketed. And I started to see probably about 3 weeks ago a real uptick in people talking about, you know, using this pause to really bend the trend on various subjects. And for those of you who took a sneak peek at the notes, you can see that I got into this because of community development and education primarily. And then in the last 2 years, have gotten connected with people who are really trying to create more life-affirming global narratives. And it's not like there's one, but there are many being developed, all with the idea that what we have been doing isn't very life affirming. But I wanted to start with just the idea of narratives. Because I'll tell you, even in my own family, when I mention the word narrative, some people's eyes cross. They're like, what the heck? There's no narratives. There's just things. There's just things. And there's things that are and things that aren't. And what are you talking about narratives? And so to give a little background, in my organizational development work in corporations, I came across the idea of narratives within the corporation. So not like a mega narrative, but what is the narrative of the corporation? What are we trying to do? What do we believe in? Who are we trying to serve? And really making that clear to people. So I started doing that work in probably 1988. And then that was accelerated in 1998 when I started working at the Gazette, and we had to reimagine what a local media company would be like. But it went into overdrive in 2008. And in 2008, when I was responsible for the Gazette and KCRG, I was also the incoming chair of the Chamber of Commerce. I was on the board of Cedar Rapids Bank and Trust, on the board of Coe College. And so I was asked to host a meeting with Secretary Gutierrez, who was the Secretary of Commerce at the time. And it was one of the worst meetings I've ever attended, because there were people who had suffered grave damages in their business, and there was no aid for business. The whole structure of flood recovery did not include business. There was aid for individuals, there was aid for governments, no aid for business. And he felt sorry for me and literally put his arm around me and said, I can't send you money, but I'm going to send you my best and brightest. And I'm going to have them come out and really have a heart-to-heart talk with you and a couple community leaders. So the two leaders of the Economic Development Administration, which is under the Department of Commerce, Ben Arukar and Sandy Barua, came out and asked to meet with a small group. And that was me as the alleged non-governmental community leader, and Lou Barron and Linda Langston from the county, and Justin Shields from the city council member. So there's four of us, two of them were in a small room up at the top of the History Center. And they said, look, we know you've never seen us before, and you've never seen us because you've been too prosperous. In fact, you guys don't even realize you're one of the most prosperous areas in the whole world. And you have a diverse prosperity with your, primary agriculture, secondary agriculture, world-class medical, world-class education, world-class avionics and financial services and appliance manufacturing and on and on. What you have here is just amazing. But now you're on our radar because you've had this fourth worst public disaster in US history. And we know you're grieving. We acknowledge that you're grieving. And we acknowledge that you want to get back what you had as quickly as possible. And we are here begging you not to do that. We're on our hands and knees begging you, because you are not aware, like many cities from Pittsburgh to Denver, that you were founded 160 years ago by a small group of white men who were trying to solve the problem of material want on the frontier. So they adopted a set of beliefs and a set of narratives that led them for that period. And you guys have had a great run. You've had a wonderful run living that narrative materially. But that is not the game going forward. The game going forward is crystal clear, and almost nobody in America is paying attention to it. But you guys have had this disaster, so you have the opportunity to pay attention to it. And that is a couple things. Number one, the game going forward is local communities that are truly inclusive and sustainable, connected globally. And when you're connecting globally, the only thing that matters is the region, the natural economic region. So you guys are in a natural economic region that covers about 500,000 people, and it doesn't follow any political boundaries. But then that region is a natural part of the Chicagoland region. It's just no question about it. You are, Minneapolis is, Kansas City is, St. Louis is. So you should be trying to figure out what your role in the world is given that. And you should be linking with Madison and Champaign-Urbana and Lincoln, Omaha, and Des Moines, Ames, and figuring out what AAU research institution-led regions are about in the world. Well, that hit me like a ton of bricks. And so I thought, yep, we got to change the narrative. That's exactly what we got to do. As my son in Washington, who some of you know, Scott, calls that my valiant yet diluted effort. So I drove myself into the ground trying to do that, and then gave up to focus on business for a while. And then so 5 years after the flood, the Franciscan nuns at Prairie Woods invited a very well-known community builder, Peter Block, to come and have a big community building session with 540 people. And so I was interested in that. And he was going to bring Walter Brueggemann and John McKnight with him. John McKnight is famous for asset-based community development. And Walter Brueggemann is an Old Testament scholar that's very widely regarded by anybody who's gone to seminary in the last 40 years. And I said Peter Block was active community builder. Well, okay, so that was on the radar. And then College invited Salman Rushdie to come and speak. And I thought, well, I don't want to see him. I heard he was not a very nice man. And I've dealt with enough not very nice men in my life, and I don't need to deal with him. But then I thought, oh, well, it's Coe, and I want to support Coe, and sure, we'll go to see him. And so we went, and I don't know what he was like before, but when he was at Coe, he was really amazing. He was, you know, funny, sharp, articulate, gracious, gave a wonderful presentation. And at the end of that presentation, somebody raised their hand in the Q&A and said, "You're just a storyteller. How do you keep going? I mean, what is this? You know, you're just a storyteller." And I expected him to kind of snap his head off, but he didn't. He just kind of smiled at him and graciously said, "Well, you, whether you acknowledge it or not, are living a narrative. And as a free human being, from time to time, it's good to examine that narrative. You don't want to do it every day, but every once in a while you ought to dust it off and see if it's still resonating with you. And when you're doing that work, which means you've got to hold on to that which is really dear, discard that which is no longer useful, and construct that which you think may be useful, it's really good to have access to alternative narratives. That's my job. That's what keeps me going. I develop alternative narratives, bring you into worlds that you can't imagine. So I thought, wow, that was really something. That was a great answer. So then 6 weeks later, I pick up Walter Brueggemann and Peter Block from Cincinnati and bring them to Cedar Rapids to be with the nuns at Prairie Woods and 540 other people. And Walter, for the whole time I was bringing him here, was like the funniest guy I had ever met. I mean, I was thinking, here's this Old Testament scholar. He's going to be really dry and particular. And it was just nonstop laughs for 24 hours before he got up to speak. And so I thought, well, what is this guy going to say? And he started off so powerfully with all of human history is the resolution of conflicting narratives. Yet in this place and in this time, not meaning Cedar Rapids, but meaning America, we are so committed to one narrative that we're losing our ability to even imagine that alternative narratives are there, are possible, let alone resolve the differences. And that hit me like a ton of bricks as I took them back to the hotel, and then as I was driving home, the narratives of my life were crystal clear, but none was compelling. Just, we were kind of at sea. And the next day, they'd had a whole bunch of series of conversations. And then they said, you know, communities are made up of different aspects. So you've got government and healthcare and education and transportation and human services, all these different things. We're going to put posters around the wall and walk toward that thing that attracts you. And I was attracted to education. So, and the goal was to find 5 people that you did not know and sit with them. So I sat down, and then a woman came and sat down next to me, and she just went, "Oh, God, this has been so great to have authentic conversations for the last day. I can't do that at my school." And I went, "What? What do you do?" She said, "Well, I'm an elementary school teacher." And I said, "What? You can't be yourself? You can't say what's on your mind?" She said, "Oh, no. It's just crazy. It's chaos. We're just scurrying around trying to meet these conflicting external demands and just trying to keep our principal from being fired." And then the other 4 people sat down, and it turned out that they were also all elementary school teachers. They all did not know each other. They were all from different districts in eastern Iowa. And they said the same thing, basically. So that was like the saddest thing I'd ever heard. And I thought, well, this just can't be everywhere, you know? So I went to the Cedar Rapids School District. I went to the Grantwood AEA. I went to the Iowa Department of Education. And I just said, I don't even care what game they're playing. Just does everybody understand the game we're trying to play? And are they settled and can be authentic about what their reactions are? Can they sense and respond into some narrative? And they said, no, we don't know of any like that. So I won't go the whole thing. It was an amazingly circuitous trek to get to a school in London that I was introduced to. And the first time I walked in the door, I just couldn't believe it. I mean, it was such a joyful place in inner city London. And everybody's happy and everybody's learning. And I had no idea that 10 years before, they had been completely failing. And the government was going to shut them down. And for good reason, because nobody was learning. High conflict, police called every day. As one of the people who were there then said, anybody who could be yelling was yelling. And so I talked to the team that took it over and tried to keep it alive, keep it going. You know, like, what theories did you apply? And they just looked at me and laughed and said, are you kidding me? We didn't have time for theories. It was utter chaos. All we could do was sense and respond. And so I took them at their word at that. But as I got to know them better and work with them, I realized, yeah, they said they were sensing and responding, but they had a really strong framework, which in my mind is another word for narrative. And it started with every child is valuable just because they're here. And every child has a unique, authentic voice, unique to them. And the purpose of school is to enable them to express it effectively. And so that's our job at school, but we do that because it's delightful in the moment. We're humans. We like learning language. We like playing with numbers. We like learning science. We like learning history. It's not for any future gain. They never talk to the kids about going to the next grade or the next school or becoming a professional or going to college or anything like that. It's just all, we're humans who delight in learning. And by not focusing on those objective measures, they became one of the top schools in the UK. Now, I have to admit, at the time, I had a limited framework and a limited focus. It has driven me crazy for the last 30 years that we can't do a better job of teaching reading in this community. Only 40% of our fourth graders and eighth graders read joyfully for comprehension. Another 30% can. They don't really like to, but they can. And another 30% cannot. And that's been that way for decades. And the narratives around that are sick. We developed methods of teaching reading when we had no clue how it happened. So people just made stuff up and then tried it on the kids. And then when kids didn't take to it, well, something's wrong with the kid or something's wrong with the kid's parents, because almost every teacher is in early elementary is a woman who loved school and who did not have to struggle to learn to read. So I love school. I love my teacher. I love books. I had books in front of me. I learned to read. Something's wrong with these kids. Something's wrong with their parents. That was always the narrative. So here I was in inner city London in what they call one of the most deprived neighborhoods in all of the United Kingdom. Kids come with very little oral language, and many have been severely traumatized, and yet they are all succeeding. When I say all, there was one child with severe neurological defects that they could not reach. But so 99+% of the kids they're reaching, and these are some of the most deprived children in the whole United Kingdom. So the kids didn't change from the time when everybody was failing and 80% were classified as special ed to everybody succeeding and nobody classified as special ed. And the kids did not change. The neighborhood did not change. The parents did not change. The teachers and administrators changed. And when I talked to the leaders about that transformation, they said, well, yeah, we just had to play a new game and we had to get people on board. And so we talked with the kids about what the rules were going to be. And we might make the rules as simple as possible. And we have 20 staff members and we got 19 on board. I go, wow, that's pretty good. 19 to 1. Gee, that's a great ratio. You probably did fine. And they said, nope. We all worried about the 1. We were all tangled up and our energy was all tangled up with the 1. And it wasn't until we counseled the 1 out that we could really get going. So I was greatly impressed with the power of narratives. And what they told me was, I should have said, did make 3 videos about the school. And the leader said, you know, we had sensed and responded our way into this, but we couldn't really see it and we couldn't easily tell people about it. But your videos have made it easier for us to see ourselves and to see the narrative we're living. Would you please write it down? So I did write it down with a couple other people's help, one of whom you might know, Ben Smith from Berlin, and who grew up in Cedar Rapids. And we shared that with a couple of people, and then they shared it with a few other people, and they shared it with a few other people. All of a sudden, I'm talking to 70 people around the world about a very different approach to education. And in the last 3 weeks, that has tremendously accelerated. And to me, it's because people in the school system usually are like besieged and have no time to think about anything except the next day. And now they have a little more time and they're like, what are we going to do when we come back? So I've talked for a little over 20 minutes here. I'm really encouraged by that thread. And before I open up for questions, I'm going to just say one more thing. What cracked me up is because I made these videos in London, I was known in London as the documentarian. So I got invited to the House of Lords. to speak about, excuse me, early childhood education, which is a very imposing thing, by the way. I mean, the House of Lords is really, really fancy, very fancy. And so one of the lords, Lord Andrew Stone of Blackheath, asked me to go to tea with him. And so I'm sitting at the table in the Lord's tea room in the House of Lords. And you have to appreciate this. I mean, this is a really intense guy. He's about 75 years old. What is the essential issue? And I said, well, we are using ineffective methods within too limited a cosmology. And he just smiled at me and he said, you need to meet this quantum physicist. Well, when would that be? April 8th. That's when she's come to London. April 8th. You got to be here to meet this quantum physicist. I said, I'm sorry, I can't do it. I promised my son I'd help him take his tiny house to Seattle. Oh. But I did get connected with the quantum physicist virtually. And she also made a presentation in Chicago. So I met with her in Chicago. And then she connected me to other quantum physicists who connected me to other quantum physicists. And they have a whole group that's trying to figure out how to explain to the world that what we think is reality isn't, which is why I wanted Aidan on here, because we've had our cosmological discussions in person at the adult inside class in the past. And so it's also interesting to me how that is exploding. And so people from MIT, Otto Scharmer and the Presencing Institute, these quantum physicists from London who've started something called Whole World View, are really thinking that we're not going to get out of this jam until we have a much different conception of what nature is and what our role in nature is. So with that, I'm going to unmute everybody and see if anybody's got a question. Whew.
So Chuck, I'd like to ask you what you're doing after this meeting.
Well, this education network that I've got, I mean, it's amazing to me the tentacles of, you go talk to somebody and then they talk, oh, you got to talk to this person. And I realized, I'll give you the answer, Jack, quickly, but a little context. Because this paper went around, and I ended up talking probably to 100 people all over the world about those issues, I ended up connected to serious academic people in the education space who basically said, look, these threads in education have been going on for thousands of years. I mean, we in the US just made a certain set of assumptions, 120 years ago. Doesn't mean the ones we need to have, but there's a really interesting group in Australia, a woman principal and several of her teachers that are trying to run an elementary school according to how children actually develop. Not for the adults, not for how the adults wish they developed, but for how the children actually develop. So I'm on a Zoom call with them after this. Yeah, thanks. I spend a lot of time on Zoom these days.
Don't we all? Don't we all?
Good to see you, Heather.
Yeah.
Do you have a question?
No, I do not.
So Heather and the pastor nominating committee know that I was a royal pain in the neck in the pastor nominating search, saying this church needs to help people live into the quantum reality and stop screwing around with these old ideas. But then I moved to Washington, so I don't get to see how you guys are doing on that. Aidan, do you don't have a question? I did all this for you.
Oh, I don't have a question, but I thought that it was interesting.
Thank you. I'll take that.
Chuck, I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
It seems like with social media, and you alluded to this, I think, at the beginning of your talk, there seems to be a tendency for the narratives to get sort of formed, and then they sort of become self-reinforcing as people define their own ecosystem of friends and connections.
Right.
And that seems to be the conventional wisdom, anyways, is that narratives can in this new digital social networking world are actually kind of in a destructive thing, because
Yeah.
people are not reassessing their assumptions as often as they might otherwise. Do you agree with that perspective? And do you think there's anything that we can do to make that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. That's a great question. I mean, I know people always say that, but really is, man, that's really a great question, because that is the issue. We talked about it at the beginning. When you're in a narrative, you can't even see it.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, there's some research, that being the CEO of a large corporation for more than 10 years is equivalent to a head injury, because you have to totally believe in the organization's narrative, and you have to defend it from all comers, which narrows your perceptual field. So it's what you're talking about. You get into a narrative, and then you get into the echo chamber of social media. Oh yeah, you're right. You tell them. Yeah, you're right. Right on, keep going. And so you literally narrow and narrow and narrow, and you can get more egotistically sure of yourself, which is why I love the quantum physicists, because every narrative is flawed. There is no narrative that's right. I mean, you have to choose. Every individual has to choose a narrative that they think is in accord with their natural pattern and life affirming. But we all have to choose that. There is not one out there that you can just go, yeah, you got it. You're right.
So Chuck,
Yes.
one of the things I've noticed in social media, but in journals I read, and even New York Times, Washington Post, is that there's a great deal of frustration among some of my colleagues, I'll call them, who just can't understand why the world isn't listening to us scientists.
Yeah.
And I know it's a very narrow narrative, but there is a certain amount of frustration, especially from those people who are saying, well, I was talking about this in January. Why weren't you listening then?
Right.
And this frustration sometimes boils over on some of their posts.
Mm-hmm.
Some are better able to contain it than others. I assume they have other outlets for their frustrations. How does that frustration then impact future narratives on similar topics? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I have been following that as well. I'm following that thread, particularly the scientists that have been telling us for years about global warming, the scientists that have been telling us for years about the threat of pandemic, and then to have our leaders say, well, who knew? Who could have seen this coming? Nobody could have imagined this, I think I think one of the things is, in my pet thing, is we've got to be more explicit with children in school about the mystery of science. So much of what I learned in science and what people tell me from recent years is it's very driven by what is known. And you need to know what is known. So in my general critique of education systems, we love what is known that can be tested, and we get compliance to what is known, instead of saying, hey, it's a big mystery and there's much more that's unknown than known. What do you want to see? A few little threads we got here? Here's a few threads, but you've got a lot of work to do, and you got to be open and doing your research. And instead, the number one thing I got out of school is that there is a right answer. And the person who gets it fastest is best. And so that's not good for either the people who are getting it fastest or the rest of them, because it also generates a lot of antipathy towards the people who got it fastest. Oh, you're just an elite intellectual. You're living in some ivory tower. I don't need to listen to you. That's my thought on it. But it's a real issue. The other thing is, to me, the global narratives in which we've been operating for the last 50 years are clearly failing. There is no way that new narratives are going to be developed by those in the existing hierarchy. So it's up to people in local communities to gather, develop narratives that are actually helpful, and keep going and keep networking. And I did list in the information something that MIT's Presencing Institute is doing globally called the Gaia Initiative. And it's just people all over the world trying to construct more helpful narratives. So I'm encouraged about that. Other burning questions? So what I'm going to do, just give me a minute here.
Chuck,
Yeah.
What's the answer on the education front?
Well, there's two levels I work at. One is, how do we get more kids reading? And how do we get more kids reading joyfully? Because if you can't read, you're stuck with the oral narrative of your local community. And I don't wish that on anybody. So, I mean, not that it's not, but it just, you got to have more options. So I am happy to report that Cedar Rapids is starting to get with it on reading. And it's just astounding to me that a simple thing is so hard. For decades, we believed that kids will read because they see others liking to read, so that they will, just read books and love books like we do. And we have been enamored with the alphabet. I mean, we love the alphabet. We just beat up little kids to learn the alphabet. When all the research shows that's exactly what you don't want to do. You want to develop rich oral language, really rich oral language with lots of perspective, lots of stories, lots of poems, and get kids not only building vocabulary, but building perspective, and then play with the sound structure of speech. And I have to tell you, I know this is true in Cedar Rapids, they've made huge headway in the last 6 years. I mean, they've gone from really backwards, and backwards because they were driven by the University of Iowa and Iowa State and UNI, who are some of the most backward colleges in the world on reading. It's just astounding here in Iowa. But they were driven, but now they've kind of awakened, and they've pushed to try to get more in line with the science, and then realized literally their teachers could not perceive the sound structure of speech, which is not a knock on the teachers, but it's a developmental stage, and once you're past it, you don't care about it. So for the teachers to open themselves up again and say, oh yeah, this is important to be able to do syllabification. I mean, obviously sound structure of speech, there are sentences, right? There's breaks at sentences. There are words. Words are composed of syllables. There's beginning sounds, ending sounds, middle sounds. Each of those sounds can be broken apart to an individual sound. So you got to get a kid to be able to perceive that. Now, Jack, that I work with researchers at the University of Iowa who got a federal grant to study middle school students. And they were astounded. I mean, we knew that half the middle school students weren't reading well, but half of them were missing basic phonological awareness, the sound structure of speech, which they should have gotten at 3, 4, or 5. They never got it. And the thing is, we are hardwired for facial recognition and oral language. Every baby does great on recognizing faces and acquiring oral language if they're in a rich oral language environment. But they don't naturally perceive the sound structure of speech. They learn oral language like a melody or a flow. And so if you, no, let's, I mean, probably 30% of the kids figure it out on their own, but 70% need somebody to show them, hey, this is how this works. Ding, 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 ding. Here's all the parts of speech. Now, we're going to take these individual sounds and we're going to map them to print. There's only 44 sounds in the English language. It's not that hard. But when you don't go at it that way, it's really hard, because if you go to a kid and say, what sound does the letter A make? It's really complicated, right? It's really complicated. Like there's only 44 sounds, but there's 256 ways to spell them. So as one of the literacy experts in the UK told me, I cannot believe that the United States, with its wealth, is so backwards in reading. I mean, if you guys even get to the idea that you ought to focus on sounds, you do it backwards. You ask these poor kids, what sound does this letter make? Letters don't make sounds. People make sounds, and they're represented by squiggles. If you don't get that basic thing, right, you're just screwing these kids up. Anyway, and so this is why narratives are important. We don't even see that we're in love with the alphabet. We don't even see that every poor kid who walks into a preschool has got an alphabet chart there, which is a complete abstract craziness to him or her, right? Anyway, I can get all worked up about it. But the good news is really seeing progress in Cedar Rapids. They're going to require that every kindergarten, first grade, second grade teacher be trained in the science of reading. So that's a big step forward over 6 years ago.
So are you advocating for phonics again?
It depends on how you call phonics. The way most people do phonics is absolutely backwards. They go the alphabet and then they say, what sound does this letter make? You need to get kids in a rich oral language environment, particularly helping them create oral language, to create their stories, and then get them to pay attention to the sound structure, which is not phonics. Phonics is mapping that sound structure to print, and you want to do it from speech to print, not the other way around, like we do almost always, even if we do it at all.
I also wanted to ask about the videos that you made of the London schools.
Yeah.
Are those available on the link that you gave us?
They will be. They're all in, well, the best one is in there. And if you get to that, you'll get to the other two. I say the best one because it's only 25 minutes and the children speak. That's why I love that one. Yeah. Okay. So what I'd like to do, since we've gone over 40 minutes here, is I'm going, what? I think Jack's doing something.
Jack's doing sign language. He doesn't believe in phonics.
Yeah. I'm willing to talk longer. I just wanted to stop the recording so that we didn't burn.
Chuck, I got to check out. I'm very sorry. Thanks a lot. It's good to see you folks.
Thank you.
Take care.
So what I'm going to do, thanks, Jack. What I'm going to do is put that slide back up so that at the end here, and then I'll come back and we can have a little conversation. Just a second. Okay, here we go again. There's that link. And you know, it's I like it. It's that bit.ly, bit.ly /3 lowercase a, capital S, lowercase d, capital A, lowercase h, lowercase n. If you go there, you'll see a little write-up with a lot of the things we talked about and links to the videos and everything. So thank you. And let's have a little offline conversation where we can swear and everything.
Thanks,
Chuck.
Thank you, Chuck.
Yeah. So just a second here, just a second.